When it comes to climate change, the messaging of what will happen can often be confusing. Scientists predict everything from rising waters to ancient diseases that emerge from melting ice to droughts and heat waves that render large parts of the world uninhabitable. And while countries are taking some concrete steps towards addressing the problem, including the most recent Paris Climate Agreement, many people say it's just not enough. So, just how effective is the message? Time for Power Source. Tom Rand is a senior advisor with Mars Clean Tech Venture Group. Ken Green is senior director with the Centre for Natural Resource Studies at the Fraser Institute. And I'm going to start with you, Ken, because I'm drawn to one thought here. Athletes and university students both know that a little anxiety is probably good. Too much, it just destroys your ability to do anything. Where are you on this? Are we worried, too worried, or what?
Well, what I think is that we have some people who are putting out messages that are so extreme and so catastrophic that it turns a lot of the public off, that people tune it out. If you tell them that the world is ending, we're all going to die, if we don't immediately change our entire lifespan, our lifestyle and life pleasures and things like that, living arrangements and driving arrangements, and they're just going to look at you and throw up their hands and say, you know, dude, you need more foil for that hat. And so I don't really think it's a good idea to be having the worst of worst case scenarios like this article in New York Magazine that we were talking about, which it is every single worst case scenario under the sun short of zombies and mummies. And it's been discredited by 17 conventional climate scientists, including the very not skeptical Michael Mann. So I really think that they need to normalize the problem of climate change and then apply normal policy procedures and technologies to it. The way they've blown it up for 30 years now, really, they interfere with attempts to normalize the problem and use normal solutions rather than speed them along. But
don't you need to cry fire sometime, not spark?
Yeah, you need to be real about the risk. And what's happened, I mean, there are a certain group of the populace, as well as in the punditry, that will not buy into the notion that climate risk is severe and potentially catastrophic. I'd point out that that article, while there's lots of details in it, is performing a simple service, which is saying, look, you can call it worst case if you like. That language doesn't quite work anymore. What the article is saying is we are heading to high probabilities of catastrophic events, the details of which we don't quite know yet, but we have a high probability of catastrophic events on business as usual. In other words, if we don't do anything, we're headed for trouble. Let me give you an analogy. So, young man of 35, healthy, goes to the doctor and says, I really like donuts. I eat 20 donuts a day, I get a nice kick from it, and the doctor says, well, you know, that'll work for a while, but, you know, you will become chronically obese, you will get diabetes, and you will likely die of heart failure by the time you're 55. So it goes to another doctor. Another doctor says the same thing. And doctor after doctor says, you're going to be in trouble in 20 years. 10 years go by, and he's 45 now, and we're beginning to feel some of the health effects. We know that this analogy, of course, is climate change. It's our ecosystem and the embedded economy. We're beginning to feel the effects of climate change. The article plays a role to say, look, the deep systemic catastrophic risks that are outlined by the science are real. And they're in front of us if we don't do anything. They're not the result of doing something different. They're the result of doing the same thing again and again and again. And the public is ready to hear those risks now. You know, in many different languages. Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England, thinks climate change is the single greatest threat to financial stability. The Pentagon has identified it as the single largest threat multiplier that makes all the other problems to deal with worse. So in different languages, different groups are saying, look, these threats are real. We can disagree about the details, but the public seems ready to hear those kinds of stories now. I would point out that that New Yorker magazine article was the most read article in its history. So I think people are ready to hear about those risks. And I would also note that the man with the donuts, you can't just point out, look, this is a really nice basket of fresh fruit here. You have to point out the risks that person is facing. In the same way, we need to be honest and open about the risks that we face from catastrophic climate change. Ken's right.
Tom,
we need to be clear about what the risks are and not overstate them. But to be clear, I think this is where Ken and I will disagree. There are some
Let's give him a chance.
They'll never take on board catastrophic risk, no matter what argument or what data you give. And I think Ken is one of those.
Ken, what are people ready to hear? What do you think they should hear right now?
Well, I think they're ready to hear that there is that thing called climate change, that it's real and that it poses risks, and that we should transition to a lower greenhouse gas emission economy. I think they're ready for that. Polls show that they are no longer in support of the federal carbon tax, for example, the majority. I don't think they're ready to hear the extremist messages, and frankly, I don't think you're going to scare the kids away from the donuts. That's not going to happen. Right? That's why the United States has an obesity epidemic, despite the fact that for 40 years or 50 years, you had the American Heart Association, the American Lung Association, all of these dietetic associations saying, no, 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 no. You still have people going for it.
That's a good analogy.
So the other thing is that, you know, there's a psychological trait called believing in a fair, basically a fair universe, that you're not going to be catastrophically punished for trying to make a good life. And most people tend to believe that the universe is a balanced thing, that things will work out. So the more as I said, the more you hit the catastrophe, the more you tune them out, and the more they think that doing even the pragmatic stuff is futile, when it's not. If we switch to natural gas, like the United States did, we can make much more progress by laying on extra wind or solar power or putting in carbon taxes, things like that. But again, the catastrophe is Al Gore's back on his cherry-picking crane in his update of his Inconvenient Truth, and now we have this New York Magazine thing. We're all going to die. That is not going to motivate people any more than it has since Kyoto Protocol and 30 years ago.
This is a business show. This is a show directed at adults who run businesses, who understand how to talk about risk. If you want to deal with risk, you take the best expert opinion on what that risk looks like, you face it square in the eye, and you approach it. And that's what that New Yorker article is trying to do. There's quibble about the details, but the fact that we have systemic, existential, severe risk coming our way if we don't change our behavior is true and corroborated by any red panel group that looks at this thing. And as business people, we need to be clear about what risks we face and act accordingly. Wanting the universe to be fair is not a good approach to risk assessment.
Ken, I'm going to give you the last word, and I'm hearing Tom Cruise in my head saying, you can't handle the truth.
I think that was Jack Nicholson, wasn't it? But anyway, in any event, I think people are rationally opposed to catastrophism. By the time they're 25, we've heard dozens of catastrophe predictions that are every bit as certain as this is portrayed, that don't come to pass. The polar bears are all dying. No, they're not. We won't have bananas in the future. Well, yes, we will. The bees are all dying. We'll never have honey again. Well, no, it's not true. And empirically, you see these doomsayers over and over and over again, and they're wrong. And if you believed Al Gore, Paul Ehrlich, and lately Stephen Hawking, we'd all be dead a dozen times by now. But we're not. And so I'm not a catastrophist, as Tom pointed out. I'm a pragmatist. And I think the risk is more moderate to mild than it is, well, God, we're all going to die. But I don't think we're likely to meet in the middle on that.
All right. And we're going to meet again, I'm sure, on this show.
The head of the Environmental Protection Agency said his staff will assess the accuracy of this report. Scott Pruitt has been skeptical about the role CO2 plays in climate change. The Trump administration has until August 18th to sign off on this report. That gives us time to squeeze in the Power Source panel. Tom Rand is a senior advisor for Mars Cleantech, and Ken Green is a senior director for the Center for Natural Resources at the Fraser Institute. Nice to see you both.
Good to be with you.
All right, Ken, I want to start with you. What do you make of Scott Pruitt's comments, assessing the accuracy of a report like this?
Well, I want to first start out by saying I'm amazed that I can say that I actually agree with Ms. Hayhoe. This is nothing new. This is a report very much like the Working Group 1 report of the IPCC. The U.S. Global Climate Change Research Project does this every couple of years to advise the government mostly on a U.S.-centric research agenda as to what's likely to happen in the U.S. and North America, what the U.S. and North America can do. The controversy over this now is whether Donald Trump will, and his EPA administrator will let it go through. And I worked in the States for a long time, as you know. These particular reports have always been somewhat criticized for their politicization. They're written by agencies to direct the government's resources to the same agencies, right? And so from the beginning, every administration that gets one of these reports, they all assess the science, they all assess the accuracy of the report, and then they either call for modifications or they publish the report. So it's really just the same old story. Under the Clinton administration, when these reports started, they were quite highly criticized for the risk of politicization. But I don't have much I have little or no disagreements with what I read of this current report in terms of it's still within 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit warming since 1880. The majority since 1950 is human caused, and the U.S. is not on track to meet its targets under the Paris Agreement. I don't think there's any disagreement there, but it's what do we do about it, and that's where we go back and forth. What do we do about it, rather than disagreeing or arguing about is it real and what are the estimates and that sort of thing. I think there's more fruit to be had, honestly, in dropping that whole area of discussion and just talking about what we do.
Well, and I think what we do about it is the key to this. But I think the fact that the head of the agency is talking about, he used far more loaded language than I think we've heard in the past. This is a report of 13 federal agencies, but then was taken and put together by scientists that was peer reviewed by, 14-person committee. This is not inconsequential science, Tom. And does the issue then become the fact that it looks like the head of the EPA just doesn't believe what he's hearing on something that even Ken says is not terribly new?
Yeah, I think Scott Pruitt of the EPA is representative of something more insidious. For a long time now, let's be clear, there's been no real disagreement amongst the scientific community. There is no real disagreement in the business community. The CEO of ExxonMobil is in agreement that we're in a lot of trouble. The disagreement really comes from the sort of populist, hard-right portion of the GOP. And people are allowed to believe what they want to believe. I'm glad to hear that Ken has come a long way since our first encounter on the show, where he looked out the window and claimed he couldn't see climate change and therefore wasn't worried. So it's good to have you on board, Ken. The question now, as Ken says, is what do we do about it? Now, the real challenge we have here, and I would urge us on this segment to ask this with good faith. If the problem is real and severe, if we take the scientific consensus at face value, that should inform the degree to which we should try to mitigate the problem. Now, Scott Pruitt, in misrepresenting the problem, is representing the last place there's any disagreement. And that's in this kind of populist-driven, anti-expert right wing in the United States. And we saw some of it here in Canada. And that's just not a proper, informed way to make decisions about risk and economic opportunity.
I think we're getting Yeah, I think we're getting a bit ahead, putting the cart a bit ahead of the horse here. We don't know what Scott Pruitt's going to say or do with regard to this particular report. It's been, as I said, these reports have come out every couple of years and are always reviewed by the EPA staff and then either signed off on or modified or tweaked. And I think the scrutiny level under Trump is going to be so high that if they do make major modifications, there will be a clamor beyond what we've seen in the past. But again, I think the question is, and I've been on board, Tom, since 1997, and since I reviewed one of the IPCC Working Group 1 reports of the third assessment report. But the argument is, the question is, what do we do about it? And I think Tom would argue that the level of urgency dictates we must immediately make a revolutionary shift in the way we power society and the way we power our lives. And I would argue that that's simply not going to happen because of the fundamental economics of the energy systems we need and use to thrive as a people and as a civilization. And therefore, we need to be more focused on adaptation and how we're going to adapt to some climate change that is going to filter through the system and mostly be reflected in hydrological cycle changes and weather pattern changes. And these are things we've adapted to for hundreds of years. And I see no reason to believe we can't adapt to many of them again, even as we do transition over to things like natural gas from coal power and bring down greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, I'm happy to go back and review the tapes where you have explicitly claimed climate change is not a significant threat. But I'm glad you say it's a significant threat now. The challenge we have, and this is where I think we should focus, and Ken's right, we need energy. So if Ken believes that clean energy is not capable of stepping up to the job, the irony is then climate change will be much worse. I, who think clean energy can step up to the job and should be significantly supported both as an economic opportunity but also as a risk mitigation on climate, therefore climate change should be less severe. So I should be taking the dove position on climate because I think clean tech can do the job. Ken should be taking the hawkish position, but we're somehow reversed. And Ken, you have stated a number of times in the past that this risk is not severe. So I'm glad we're done with that, and from here on in, let's talk about solutions.
We're not done with that. What I said is I adhere to the range of risks that put forward by the IPCC, 1.5 degrees centigrade to 4.5 degrees centigrade, and I think recent evidence, empirical evidence, suggests we'll be in the lower part of that range, more in the 1.5 to 2 degree range.
You understand we're at 1.5 degrees now, we're at 1.4 degrees now, Ken. So.
Okay. You know what? We only have about 30 seconds left, and I'd like to get a question into Ken on this. You're saying what we need to focus on is adaptation. What are the economic policies? What do we need to do to get us through what adaptation might actually look like?
Well, there's a basket of them. I would propose that we do things like fix our insurance market so that people who are living and investing in building large, expensive buildings near meteorologically unstable areas, which they have been doing over recent years, leading to increased property damages. We need to fix the insurance incentives that lead people to do that unwisely so that over time and in a gradual way that doesn't displace people's families or homes, we move away from hydrologically sensitive areas, flood zones, coastal areas, things like that. We also need to have more efficient pricing of our infrastructure and our resources. So water is going to be in a drought in some areas. They're going to have too much water in other areas. If we had a functioning continental water market that could move large amounts of water, we could mitigate much of that damage. The same is true for highways. If they were priced, there's a signal for raising them and elevating them. Same for seawalls. Right. Same for electricity. There's a whole package that we can do that I call the resilience option and adaptation that we could start doing right away. And I think that's the approach we should take until we get the technologies we need to make cleaner energy that's also affordable.
Gotcha. Okay, I do have to leave it there. I asked you a complicated question with only 30 seconds left, so that's kind of on me. Ken, thanks for this. Tom Rand in St. John, where he used to work. Say hi to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks to you both.